The day I found out the HOA had been using my propane to heat their new pavilion was the same day my monthly bill came in at $2,300, and I knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. I'm Henry Vance, and I've lived in the Pleasant Valley Estates subdivision in Spokane, Washington for the past 7 years. The house was my dream property when I bought it, a 4-bedroom craftsman on 2 acres at the edge of the development. What made my lot special was the propane tank I'd installed to heat my home and workshop, choosing independence from the city's natural gas lines. That decision would come back to haunt me in ways I never imagined. The envelope from Mountain West Propane sat on my kitchen counter that Tuesday morning in February, and I almost spilled my coffee when I tore it open. $2,300. My typical winter bill ran about $400, maybe $500 during a cold snap. This was insane. I called Mountain West immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. A woman named Rebecca answered on the 3rd ring. "This has to be a mistake," I said, barely containing my frustration. "There's no way I used this much propane. Let me pull up your account, Mr. Vance." I heard typing on the other end. "Okay, I see you're at 1847 Meadowbrook Drive. According to our records, your usage has increased significantly over the past 2 months. We had to do 3 fills instead of your usual 1. That doesn't make any sense. I keep my thermostat at 68. I haven't changed anything. Have you had any guests staying with you, running the heat higher than usual?" "No, it's just me. I live alone." Rebecca paused. "Well, the meter doesn't lie, Mr. Vance. You've used the propane. I can have a technician come out to check for leaks if you'd like, but there'll be a service fee." I scheduled the appointment for the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. After hanging up, I bundled up in my winter coat and walked out to the propane tank, located on the far corner of my property. The ground was covered in about 6 inches of snow, and my breath came out in white puffs in the 20-degree air. The tank looked normal at first glance, a large white cylinder sitting on its concrete pad. But as I walked around it, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the snow, lots of them, and they didn't belong to me. Following the prints, I saw they led away from my tank, across the property line, and toward the HOA's newly constructed community pavilion. The pavilion had been a source of controversy for months. The HOA president, Patricia Hendricks, had pushed it through despite significant opposition from homeowners who didn't want the assessment increase. She'd rammed it through with the support of her cronies on the board, and construction had finished in December. The building sat about 200 feet from my property line, a large covered structure with a kitchen area meant for community events. I walked closer, following the tracks. At the property line, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a trench, now partially filled with snow, running from near my propane tank toward the pavilion. My stomach dropped. They wouldn't have. They couldn't have. But as I got closer to the pavilion, I saw the telltale signs of a propane line installation. The exposed edges where they dug, the slight discoloration in the snow where the ground had been disturbed and refilled. Someone had run a line from my propane tank to their building. I stood there in the cold, my mind reeling. The HOA had literally stolen my propane to heat their pavilion. No wonder my bills had skyrocketed. I was heating an entire community building without my knowledge or consent. The fury that washed over me was unlike anything I'd felt before. I marched back to my house and grabbed my phone, pulling up the HOA's contact information. Patricia Hendricks answered on the 2nd ring, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Patricia, this is Henry Vance. Did the HOA tap into my propane tank to heat the new pavilion?" There was a brief silence. I'm sorry, what are you talking about? Don't play dumb. I found the line. You ran a propane line from my tank to the pavilion without my permission. That's theft. Mr. Vance, I think you're confused. The pavilion has its own heating system. Then you won't mind if I come inspect it right now. Actually, the pavilion is HOA property and we're having an event later today. You can't just barge in whenever you want. I'm not asking permission. I'll be there in 5 minutes with my phone camera. If you've stolen my propane, I'm calling the police. I hung up before she could respond and walked straight to the pavilion. The door was unlocked and I pushed inside. The space was warm, heated by baseboard heaters running along the walls. In the back utility room, I found exactly what I was looking for. A propane line coming up through the floor, connected to a furnace system. I took dozens of photos and videos, documenting everything. Then I followed the line outside, digging through the snow with my gloved hands until I could clearly see the pipe running back toward my property. My phone rang. Patricia, Mr. Vance, you need to leave the pavilion immediately. You're trespassing. I'm documenting evidence of theft. You stole my propane, Patricia. Months worth of it. Do you have any idea how much you've cost me? The HOA has a right to access utilities within the development for community purposes. It's in the covenants. That's complete nonsense. You can't just hook into someone's private propane tank. That's theft, plain and simple. I want the line disconnected immediately and I want reimbursement for every penny you've stolen. I'll bring it up at the next board meeting in March. March? That's 3 weeks away. No, you're fixing this now. The board meets when it meets, Mr. Vance. We have procedures. Now please leave the pavilion before I call the police for trespassing. I left, but only to regroup. Back home, I called a lawyer friend of mine, Marcus Rivera, who practiced in Spokane. Henry, that's theft of services at minimum, Marcus said after I explained the situation. Possibly criminal trespass when they accessed your property to install the line. You need to document everything and file a police report. Will the police actually do anything? Depends on the officer you get, but this is pretty clear-cut. They came onto your property without permission, connected to your private utility, and used it without consent. That's theft. The dollar amount probably pushes it into felony territory. I spent the rest of the day at the Spokane Police Department's precinct office, filing a report with Officer Thompson, a middle-aged man who listened to my story with increasing interest. So they just hooked up to your tank, he asked, reviewing the photos on my phone. Without asking, without permission, nothing. I only found out when I got a $2,300 propane bill. And you have documentation of your normal usage. Years worth. I've lived there 7 years and my winter bills never topped $500. Officer Thompson nodded. I'll need to come out and document the scene. Can you meet me at your property tomorrow morning? Absolutely. That evening, Patricia called again. This time her voice had lost its false sweetness. Mr. Vance, I understand you filed a police report. That's extremely inappropriate. This is an HOA matter that should be handled internally. You stole from me, Patricia. You committed a crime. That's not an HOA matter, that's a criminal matter. The board discussed this at an emergency meeting this evening. We're willing to reimburse you $200 as a gesture of goodwill. I actually laughed. $200. You owe me at least $2,000, probably more. That's our offer. Take it or leave it. I'll leave it. I'll see you in court. Mr. Vance, I strongly suggest you reconsider your hostile attitude. The HOA has significant authority over your property. It would be unfortunate if we had to start enforcing certain violations we've noticed. Are you threatening me? I'm simply reminding you that homeowners who cooperate with the board tend to have fewer issues. Now, about the police investigation, You need to tell them it was a misunderstanding. Go to hell, Patricia. I hung up and immediately emailed Marcus about the threat. He replied within minutes. Document everything. She just made your case stronger. Officer Thompson came out the next morning with another officer, a younger woman named Garcia. They spent 2 hours documenting the propane line, taking measurements and interviewing me. The technician from Mountain West Propane arrived during their investigation and confirmed the unauthorized connection. This is definitely drawing from your tank, the technician, a guy named Rob, said. He was in his 50s with a weathered face, and it's not even properly installed. Whoever did this work didn't follow code. This could be dangerous. Can you disconnect it? I asked. Rob shook his head. Not without authorization. This is part of a police investigation now. But I can tell you that if this was feeding heat to that pavilion, and you cut the supply suddenly, any water pipes over there could freeze and burst if they don't have a backup heat source. Officer Thompson overheard this. Mr. Vance has every right to disconnect service to his own property. He's not obligated to continue providing utility service to the HOA. I'm just saying, from a technical standpoint, there could be consequences, Rob said. An idea began forming in my mind, but I kept quiet for the moment. The officers finished their investigation and told me they'd be forwarding everything to the prosecutor's office. Officer Thompson pulled me aside before leaving. Look, between you and me, HOA cases can get messy. My advice is to protect yourself legally, but don't do anything rash. Let the system work. I nodded, but I was already planning my next move. That afternoon, I got a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a notice of violation, claiming my workshop had unpermitted construction. My lawn had weeds in violation of community standards, and my garbage bins were visible from the street, also a violation. Each violation came with a $50 per day fine until corrected. It was pure retaliation, and it was obviously false. My workshop had been permitted through the county. My lawn was covered in snow, making weed violations impossible to assess, and my garbage bins were in my garage where they'd always been. I photographed everything and sent copies to Marcus, who immediately drafted a response. Over the next week, the harassment intensified. Patricia started driving by my house multiple times a day. I'd see her car, a silver Lexus, slowly cruising past. She'd park and take pictures of my property from the street. Then came the second letter. The HOA was fining me $500 for interfering with community property by filing the police report. According to their interpretation of the covenants, any dispute involving HOA property had to go through arbitration first. Marcus was furious when I showed him. That's not enforceable. They're trying to intimidate you into dropping the criminal complaint. It's working. I'm angry enough to do something stupid. Don't. Let me handle this legally. I'm preparing a lawsuit for theft, trespass, and harassment. We'll get you compensated and get them to back off. But the legal route was slow and my propane bills kept coming. Another $1,800 in the second month. The HOA was heating their pavilion constantly now, apparently hosting events multiple times a week. I was subsidizing the entire neighborhood's social calendar. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late February. I came home from work to find a notice on my door. The HOA had scheduled an emergency hearing about my continued violations and hostile behavior toward the board. The hearing was mandatory, and failure to appear would result in additional fines. I attended the hearing the following Tuesday, held in the pavilion that was being heated with my stolen propane. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia sat at the head of the table with 4 other board members. Karen Whitmore, Susan Chen, Robert Morrison, and David Park. Karen was Patricia's chief lieutenant, a woman in her late 40s with an asymmetrical haircut and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she'd been complaining about something her entire life. "Mr. Vance, thank you for joining us," Patricia began. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations and your harassment of the board." "Harassment? You stole my propane. I'm the victim here." Karen leaned forward. "That's exactly the kind of hostile attitude we're talking about. The board made a decision about utility allocation, and you've responded with threats and police reports. You can't allocate my private utilities without my permission. That's theft. The covenants clearly state that the HOA has authority over community resources," Patricia said. "My propane tank isn't a community resource. I paid for it. I pay for the propane. You have no right to it." Susan Chen, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. "Mr. Vance, perhaps we can reach a compromise. What if the HOA paid a reduced rate for the propane usage, say 50 cents on the dollar? How about you pay full price for what you've already stolen, disconnect your illegal line, and we call it even?" Robert Morrison, a heavy-set man in his 60s, slammed his hand on the table. "You don't get to make demands here. The board has authority and you need to respect that." "The board has authority within the bounds of the law. What you've done is illegal." Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Vance, we're prepared to levy a special assessment against your property of $5,000 for legal fees associated with your baseless accusations. We're also voting tonight to fine you an additional $100 per day for each ongoing violation. That's $300 per day until you comply." "You can't do that." "We can and we are. The vote is now. All in favor." 4 hands went up. Only David Park abstained, looking uncomfortable. "The motion passes. You have until the end of the week to pay all outstanding fines and correct the violations, or we'll file a lien against your property." I walked out of that hearing knowing exactly what I was going to do. The law was too slow. Marcus's lawsuit would take months, maybe years. In the meantime, the HOA would continue stealing my propane and burying me in false fines. They wanted to play hardball. Fine. I'd show them hardball. That night, I researched everything I could about propane systems and property rights in Washington state. The law was clear. I had every right to control access to my own utilities. The propane tank was mine. The propane was mine. The HOA had no legal claim to any of it. I called Rob from Mountain West Propane the next morning. "Rob, this is Henry Vance. Can you come disconnect the line running from my tank to the HOA Pavilion?" "I can, but like I said, if they're using that for heat and you cut it off, their pipes could freeze." "That's not my problem. They stole my propane. I'm not obligated to continue providing it." "Fair enough. When do you want me to come out?" "Today, if possible. I can be there this afternoon." I also called Marcus and told him my plan. He was silent for a long moment. "Henry, I understand your frustration, but you need to be careful. If you cut off their heat and something happens, they could try to sue you." "Let them. They're the ones who committed theft. I'm just protecting my property." "At least give them notice. Send a certified letter saying you're disconnecting the unauthorized line. That way, they can't claim surprise." "Fine. I'll send the letter today, but I'm disconnecting the line regardless." I drafted the letter, making it clear that as of 5 p.m. that day, the unauthorized propane connection would be severed. I took it to the post office and sent it certified mail, but I knew Patricia wouldn't receive it for at least a day or two. Rob arrived at 3 p.m. with his tools. He inspected the connection point at my tank and shook his head. "This is amateur work. Dangerous, really. You made the right call getting this disconnected." "How long will it take?" "Maybe 30 minutes. I need to cap off the line at your tank and make sure everything's secure." I watched as Rob worked, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. The temperature was dropping, with forecasts calling for overnight lows in the single digits. If the pavilion didn't have a backup heat source, things were going to get ugly fast. Rob finished the job at 3:30, testing the connections and confirming that no propane was flowing to the unauthorized line. "You're all set. That line is dead now. Whatever they've got hooked up to the other end isn't getting any gas." "Thanks, Rob." After he left, I walked toward the pavilion, staying on my property but getting close enough to observe. Lights were on inside. According to the HOA's online calendar, they had a book club meeting scheduled for 7 p.m. I went home and tried to distract myself with dinner and television, but I couldn't stop checking the thermometer on my phone. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees by 8 p.m., then 12 degrees by 9. Around 9:30, I heard sirens in the distance. They got closer, and I looked out my front window to see fire trucks and emergency vehicles pulling into the development, heading toward the pavilion. I grabbed my coat and walked over, staying at the edge of the growing crowd. What I saw was both horrifying and, I had to admit, a little bit satisfying. Water was pouring out from under the pavilion doors. The entire building's pipes had frozen and burst, and from what I could overhear from the firefighters, it was catastrophic. The baseboard heating system had ruptured in at least a dozen places. The kitchen pipes had burst. Even the bathroom was flooded. Patricia was there, of course, screaming at the fire chief. How did this happen? The heat was working fine yesterday. One of the firefighters was inspecting the utility room. He came out shaking his head. "Madam, your propane line is dead. No gas is flowing. Without heat, the pipes froze." "That's impossible. We're connected to the development's propane system." "You mean you're connected to someone's private tank?" I said, stepping forward. Patricia spun around, her face purple with rage. "You did this. You cut off the gas." "I disconnected the unauthorized line running from my private propane tank, yes. You were stealing my propane. I stopped you." "You destroyed the pavilion. You destroyed the pavilion by illegally connecting to my utilities without a backup plan. That's on you." The fire chief stepped between us. "Someone want to explain what's going on here?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken, explaining the situation. His expression grew darker as I talked. "So you installed a heating system dependent on someone else's private propane without their permission?" Patricia sputtered. "The HOA has authority over community resources. A private citizen's propane tank isn't a community resource," the fire chief said. "Madam, this is a civil matter, but I'm going to have to report this to code enforcement. This installation wasn't permitted, and it doesn't meet safety standards." Karen Whitmore pushed through the crowd. "This is Henry's fault. He sabotaged HOA property." "I protected my own property from theft," I said calmly. "I sent certified notice that I was disconnecting the unauthorized line. Not my fault if you didn't have a backup plan. You sent it today." "We didn't get any notice. That's a you problem." Officer Thompson arrived as backup to the fire department, and his eyes widened when he saw me. "Mr. Vance, what happened here?" "I disconnected the unauthorized propane line from my tank, as is my right." The HOA apparently had no backup heat source and their pipes froze. Thompson looked at Patricia. "Is this related to the theft case I'm investigating?" Patricia started to respond, but Karen cut her off. "There's no theft. The HOA has authority to access utilities for community purposes." "That's not actually true," Thompson said. "And this looks like destruction of property now. The pavilion is ruined." "He caused this," Karen shrieked, pointing at me. "Arrest him. Madam, Mr. Vance has every right to control access to his private utilities. If you built a heating system dependent on unauthorized access to his propane, that's your mistake, not his. I could see Patricia doing mental calculations, realizing how badly they'd screwed up. The pavilion was probably going to cost tens of thousands to repair. The HOA's insurance might not cover it since the damage resulted from an illegal installation, and the criminal case against them was still active. "We'll sue you for this," Patricia hissed at me. "Go ahead. I'll add it to the countersuit my attorney is already filing. Theft, harassment, retaliation, trespass. We're going to bury you." The fire chief approached Patricia. "Madam, I need to tell you that this building is condemned until the water damage is repaired and a proper heating system is installed with permits. No one can use this facility." "You can't do that." I just did. "This is a safety hazard." I walked home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Yes, the pavilion was destroyed, but that was Patricia's fault, not mine. She'd gambled that she could steal from me without consequences, and she'd lost. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 38 text messages. Patricia, Karen, and several other homeowners had been trying to reach me all night. I ignored them and called Marcus instead. "Did you hear what happened?" I asked. "I heard. Henry, this is going to get messy. The HOA is probably going to try to claim you're responsible for the damage." "Let them. I documented everything. I sent notice. I had a right to disconnect." "I know, but expect them to fight dirty. They're desperate now." Marcus was right. By noon, I had been served with papers. The HOA was suing me for $50,000 in damages, claiming I'd maliciously and negligently destroyed community property. They were also seeking an injunction to force me to reconnect the propane line. I forwarded everything to Marcus, who called me back an hour later, laughing. "This is the dumbest lawsuit I've seen in years. They're essentially admitting to theft in their own complaint. They state that they were using your propane for heat, which proves our case. So we can bet this, easily. And I'm going to file a motion to dismiss with prejudice, plus sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit. This is going to cost them." The legal battle consumed the next 2 months. I had to take time off work to attend hearings and depositions. The HOA tried every dirty trick in the book, claiming I was a difficult homeowner, that I'd threatened board members, that I'd violated countless covenants, but the facts were on my side. The police investigation had confirmed the unauthorized connection. Mountain West Propane provided records showing my usage had spiked only after the pavilion was built. Rob testified about the improper installation. Even David Park, the one board member who'd abstained from voting for my fines, came forward and admitted Patricia had pushed the propane connection through without proper approval. The criminal case moved forward too. The prosecutor charged Patricia and the HOA with theft of services and criminal trespass. Karen was charged as an accomplice since she'd been involved in the planning. In early May, I sat in the courtroom as the judge heard arguments on the HOA's lawsuit against me. Marcus had filed our countersuit simultaneously, and both cases were being heard together. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s named Barbara Reeves, listened to 3 days of testimony before making her ruling. "This is one of the most egregious cases I've encountered," Judge Reeves said, looking directly at Patricia and the HOA's attorney. "The HOA, under Mrs. Hendricks's direction, committed clear theft of services. They trespassed on Mr. Vance's property to install an unauthorized connection, then used his propane without permission or compensation for months. When Mr. Vance discovered this theft and took legal steps to protect his property, the HOA retaliated with false fines and violations. Patricia started to object, but her attorney put a hand on her arm. The claim that Mr. Vance is responsible for the pavilion's damage is without merit, Judge Reeves continued. He had every right to disconnect unauthorized access to his utilities. The HOA's failure to install a proper, legal heating system is their own negligence. I'm dismissing the HOA's lawsuit with prejudice and awarding costs and attorney's fees to Mr. Vance. I felt Marcus squeeze my shoulder as the judge continued. On Mr. Vance's countersuit, I find in his favor on all counts. The HOA is ordered to pay Mr. Vance $8,400 in restitution for stolen propane, plus $3,000 for the emotional distress caused by their harassment campaign, plus attorney's fees and costs, which I'm preliminarily estimating at $45,000 pending a detailed accounting. Patricia looked like she might faint. Karen was already crying. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to remove Mrs. Hendricks and Mrs. Whitmore from the board immediately. They are prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership capacity for 5 years. The court will monitor the HOA's governance during this period. Your Honor, that's not within your jurisdiction, the HOA's attorney said weakly. I'm making it within my jurisdiction. This HOA has demonstrated reckless disregard for the law and for homeowners' rights. Without intervention, this behavior will continue. My order stands. We left the courthouse victorious. Marcus was grinning. That was better than I'd hoped. Reeves doesn't usually issue that kind of governance order, but Patricia pissed her off. What about the criminal case? I asked. That's still proceeding. The prosecutor told me they're offering a plea deal, but I doubt Patricia will take it. She thinks she's untouchable. The criminal trial happened in July. I testified about discovering the unauthorized connection, about my propane bills, about the harassment. Officer Thompson testified about his investigation. Rob from Mountain West Propane explained the improper installation and the dangers it created. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Tomas, laid out the timeline methodically. The HOA had discussed the pavilion's heating in board meetings, but had never mentioned connecting to my propane. There was no budget item for a proper heating system. Patricia had hired a handyman under the table to run the line, paying him in cash to avoid permits and inspections. This wasn't an innocent mistake, Tomas argued in her closing statement. This was a deliberate scheme to avoid the cost of a proper heating system by stealing from Mr. Vance. When caught, they retaliated against him with false fines and harassment. This is criminal behavior that must be punished. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts for both Patricia and Karen. The judge scheduled sentencing for August. I didn't attend that hearing, but Marcus called me afterward with the results. Patricia got 90 days in county jail, 3 years probation, and 500 hours of community service. Karen got 60 days, 2 years probation, and 300 hours of community service. They also have to split restitution payments to you personally, separate from what the HOA owes. They're actually going to jail for a little while, yeah. The judge said he wanted to send a message about HOA abuse. He's been getting more and more of these cases. I felt a strange mix of emotions. I'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life. I just wanted them to stop stealing from me and leave me alone. But they'd made their choices, and now they faced the consequences. The HOA itself went through a massive overhaul. David Park became interim president and immediately started implementing reforms. The board voted to dissolve the bogus fines against me. They issued a formal apology. They hired a management company to handle day-to-day operations and ensure legal compliance. The pavilion sat empty for months while the HOA secured a loan to repair it properly. When it finally reopened in October, it had a legal, permitted heating system connected to a new propane tank that the HOA actually owned. I ran into David Park at the grocery store in November. He approached me cautiously, clearly unsure of his reception. "Henry, I just wanted to say again how sorry I am about everything that happened. What Patricia did was inexcusable. You were one of the good ones, David. You tried to stop her. Not hard enough. I should have blown the whistle earlier, but I was intimidated. She had a way of steamrolling everyone." "Well, she's not steamrolling anyone from a jail cell." David smiled weakly. "True. Anyway, the new board wanted me to tell you that we're implementing new safeguards. Every expenditure over $500 requires 3 board member approvals. Every project requires proper permits and inspections, and we're setting up an ombudsman system for homeowners to report concerns without fear of retaliation." "That's good to hear. Also, if you ever want to get involved in HOA governance, we'd welcome your input. We need people who'll stand up for homeowners' rights." I thought about it for a moment. "Maybe down the road. Right now, I just want to enjoy my house in peace." "I understand. Well, the offer stands." We shook hands, and I left feeling like maybe the neighborhood was finally moving in the right direction. My life slowly returned to normal. My propane bills went back to their reasonable levels. Marcus successfully collected the judgment from the HOA, though it required garnishing their accounts and placing liens. The association had to raise dues temporarily to cover the costs, which made me unpopular with some neighbors, but most understood I'd been the victim. I did get a few nasty letters from Patricia's supporters, people who thought I'd overreacted or who blamed me for the pavilion's destruction. One letter in particular, from a woman named Diane who lived 3 streets over, accused me of being vindictive and cruel. I wrote her back, explaining calmly that I'd simply protected my property rights after repeated theft. I offered to show her the documentation and the legal rulings. She never responded, but the hate mail stopped. In December, almost a year after I'd first discovered the propane theft, I hosted a small Christmas party at my house. I invited David Park, Marcus and his wife, Officer Thompson, and a few other neighbors who'd supported me during the ordeal. We gathered in my workshop, warmed by my legally connected propane heater, and I raised a toast to property rights, to standing up for yourself, and to not letting bullies win. Everyone cheered and clinked glasses. Marcus pulled me aside later in the evening. "You know, your case is being cited in legal circles now. There's a law review article being written about HOA overreach and homeowner remedies. You're going to be famous in a very niche way." I laughed. "That's not exactly what I was going for." "I know, but it matters. HOAs across Washington are reviewing their policies because of what happened here. You made a difference." I thought about that as the party continued around me. I'd never wanted to be a crusader or a test case. I just wanted to live in my house, use my own propane, and be left alone. But sometimes standing up for yourself meant going to war, even when you didn't want to. The pavilion drama had cost me months of stress, thousands in legal fees that I'd eventually recovered, and countless hours of lost peace. But it had also shown me that the system, for all its flaws, could work if you were willing to fight. Patricia served her 90 days and disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after her release. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved to Idaho to live with her sister. Karen completed her sentence and stayed in the neighborhood, but kept a very low profile. I'd see her occasionally at the grocery store, and she'd quickly turn and walk the other way. The HOA continued to reform under David's leadership. They published detailed financial reports quarterly. They held open forums for homeowners to voice concerns. They even established a legal review process to ensure all board actions complied with state law before implementation. Some of the other homeowners who'd been intimidated by Patricia started coming forward with their own stories. There was Mike Chen, who'd been fined $5,000 for a tree he'd planted that supposedly blocked someone's view, except the tree was on his own property and well within code. There was Rebecca Tran, who'd been hit with violations for operating a home business, even though she just did freelance graphic design and had no clients visiting. David worked to resolve these cases, often finding that Patricia had manufactured violations as personal vendettas. The board voted to rescind dozens of fines and violations issued during Patricia's tenure. By the following spring, Pleasant Valley Estates felt like a different community. The culture of fear and retaliation had been replaced with something resembling actual community spirit. People organized voluntary neighborhood cleanup days instead of being threatened with fines. The Pavilion hosted actual community events that people wanted to attend, not mandatory meetings designed to intimidate. I even started to enjoy living there again. I'd considered selling and moving away during the worst of the conflict, but now I was glad I'd stayed. This was my home and I'd fought for it. One afternoon in March, I was working in my garden when a car pulled up. A woman in her 30s got out, looking nervous. "Are you Henry Vance?" she asked. "I am. Can I help you? My name is Jennifer Walsh. I live in a development in Tacoma, and our HOA is doing something similar to what happened to you. They're trying to charge us for street lights that were never installed, and when people complain, they get fined for frivolous violations. I'm sorry to hear that. I was hoping you might talk to our group of homeowners. We're organizing to push back, but we're not sure how to proceed. Your case inspired us. I thought about Officer Thompson's advice from a year ago about not doing anything rash, about letting the system work. But I also thought about how close I'd come to just giving up and paying Patricia's extortion fees. I'm not a lawyer, and I can't give legal advice. But I can tell you what worked for me. Document everything, get a good attorney, don't be afraid to file police reports when crimes occur, and don't back down when you're in the right." Jennifer nodded, taking notes on her phone. "Did you ever regret fighting back?" "Not for a second. It was hell while it was happening, but it was worth it. You can't let bullies win." We talked for another 30 minutes, and I gave her Marcus's contact information. She thanked me profusely and drove away. I went back to my gardening, thinking about how strange life could be. A year ago, I'd been a victim of theft, drowning in illegal fines and considering moving. Now I was some kind of folk hero to oppressed homeowners across the state. The propane tank sat in the corner of my property, serving only my house as it always should have. The illegal line had been excavated and removed, the ground restored. You couldn't even tell it had been there unless you knew where to look. Sometimes I'd walk by the Pavilion on my evening strolls through the neighborhood. It was a nice building, I had to admit. With proper management and legal utility connections, it served a real purpose for the community. It could have been that way from the beginning if Patricia had just done things legally, but she'd chosen theft and intimidation instead. She'd gambled that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd be too afraid or too worn down to stand up for myself. She'd lost that bet, and it had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and ultimately her home in the neighborhood she'd tried to control. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, not really. I just took satisfaction in knowing that justice eventually had prevailed. The legal system wasn't perfect, but it had worked. The police had taken my complaint seriously. The prosecutor had filed charges. The judge had ruled correctly. The jury had seen through the HOA's justifications. And I was still here in my house, using my propane, living my life on my own terms. That summer, the HOA held its annual meeting to elect new board members. David was running for a full term as president. Several other homeowners who'd been victimized by Patricia's regime were running for other positions. I attended the meeting, my first HOA gathering since the infamous hearing where they'd tried to fine me into submission. The turnout was huge. Nearly every homeowner in the development showed up, many having been energized by the reforms and wanting to ensure good governance continued. David won his election easily. The other reformers won their races too. During his acceptance speech, David acknowledged the troubled past year. We made terrible mistakes under the previous leadership, mistakes that hurt our neighbors and violated the law. We're committed to ensuring that never happens again. This HOA should serve homeowners, not rule over them. The room erupted in applause. I found myself clapping too, genuinely hopeful about the community's direction. After the meeting, several people came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. Some apologized for not supporting me earlier. Others shared their own stories of HOA abuse that they'd been too afraid to fight. An elderly man named Frank Morrison, no relation to Robert, pulled me aside. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Patricia and her cronies tried to force me out 3 years ago. They said my house wasn't being maintained properly and threatened daily fines. I couldn't afford it, and I was about to sell and move into a cheap apartment. Then my daughter hired a lawyer who found out Patricia just wanted my property so her friend could buy it at a low price." "That's awful, Frank. What happened?" The lawyer threatened to sue and Patricia backed off. "But she made my life hell for years after that. Random fines, constant inspections, harassment. When I saw you fighting her, I wanted to help, but I was too scared. I'm ashamed of that." "Don't be. She was intimidating. That was her whole strategy." "Well, I'm not scared anymore. And if anyone tries that stuff again, I'll stand up. Because of you." I drove home that night feeling genuinely good about the neighborhood for the first time in over a year. The Pavilion had cost me thousands of dollars, months of stress, and countless hours of aggravation. But it had also exposed a corrupt HOA leadership and led to real reforms. The pipes that had exploded in the Pavilion had been a symbol, in a way. Patricia's whole scheme had been built on a foundation of theft and lies. When I cut off the stolen propane, the whole thing had collapsed, literally and figuratively. The frozen pipes, the flood, the destruction had been the physical manifestation of a fundamentally corrupt system destroying itself. I never regretted cutting that propane feed, not for 1 second. Yes, I'd known the pipes would likely freeze and burst. Yes, I'd known it would cause significant damage, but it wasn't my responsibility to maintain an illegal heating system built on theft. Patricia had created the situation. I'd simply stopped being her victim. The months that followed were peaceful. My life returned to a comfortable routine. I worked, I gardened, I enjoyed my workshop. My propane bills stayed normal. The HOA left me alone. I did join the Architectural Review Committee eventually, wanting to ensure that homeowners weren't subjected to arbitrary denials or requirements. It was boring work, reviewing fence proposals and paint colors, but it mattered. We approved reasonable requests and only denied things that clearly violated legitimate standards. Marcus told me that the law review article about my case had been published. He sent me a copy, and I read through the dense legal language with amusement. They called my situation a cautionary tale of HOA overreach and the importance of criminal accountability for board members who abuse their authority. "You're cited in footnotes now," Marcus joked. "That's academic immortality." 2 years after the propane incident, I was working in my yard when I noticed a for sale sign go up at Karen Whitmore's house. She'd stayed in the neighborhood after her jail sentence, but had remained isolated and ostracized. I felt a brief pang of sympathy, but it passed quickly. She'd made her choices. The house sold quickly to a young family with 2 kids. They were friendly and normal, completely uninterested in HOA politics. Perfect neighbors. I also heard that Patricia had been involved in an HOA dispute in Idaho, though that one had been resolved quickly when the other homeowners researched her background and discovered her conviction in Washington. Her reputation had followed her across state lines. Life moved on. The Pavilion continued to host events, all properly heated with legally obtained propane. David Park proved to be an excellent HOA president, serving multiple terms and establishing Pleasant Valley Estates as a model of good HOA governance. I stayed in my house, enjoying the property I'd fought so hard to protect. The propane tank in the corner, once a source of such conflict, became just another utility providing comfortable heat through the cold Spokane winters. Sometimes I'd think about that moment when I made the decision to cut the feed. It had been risky. Things could have gone differently. The judge could have ruled against me. The jury could have acquitted Patricia. I could have ended up owing $50,000 in damages. But I'd been right, both morally and legally. I'd documented everything. I'd followed proper procedures. I'd given notice, even if it was brief. Most importantly, I'd refused to be a victim. That was the real lesson of the whole ordeal. You don't have to accept injustice just because it's being perpetrated by people with official-sounding titles. The HOA board wasn't royalty. They weren't above the law. They were just neighbors who'd been given limited authority and they'd abused it. Standing up to them had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done. The stress, the legal fees, the uncertainty, the harassment had all taken a toll. But it had been worth it, not just for me, but for every other homeowner who'd been intimidated into silence. I made a difference. A small difference in a small neighborhood in Spokane, Washington, but a difference nonetheless. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for, to stand up for what's right, to fight when you need to fight, and to make your little corner of the world a bit more just. The propane flowed only to my house now, as it always should have. The Pavilion had its own system. The HOA followed the law. And I lived in peace, having learned that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to stand up and fight back, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when you're not sure you'll win. I won because I was right. Because I had the law on my side. Because I documented everything and refused to be intimidated. And because when they tried to steal from me, I cut them off and let the consequences fall where they belonged. On the people who'd created the problem in the first place. The exploding pipes had been their mistake, not mine. And that made all the difference.